Would you believe that inside the cockpit of modern airplanes, where the fate of hundreds of passengers is controlled, there are no surveillance cameras at all? When Air India flight AI-171 crashed on June 12, 2025, it was not just a tragedy, but also a catalyst for a debate that has been simmering for decades in the aviation industry. Emergency rescue forces quickly arrived at the scene, and shortly after, investigators from all over the world joined together in a mission to uncover what really happened in the sky that day. Immediately, the investigation team began searching for the two most important devices, the black boxes, consisting of the flight data recorder, FDR, and the cockpit voice recorder, CVR. Both were recovered within just a few days, and from them, investigators could retrieve hundreds of technical parameters along with the tense conversations between the pilots before the fateful moment. But one crucial piece was still missing: video. There was no footage showing what the pilots saw, how they reacted, or what was displayed on the screens in those final seconds. And this absence reignited a long-standing question that resurfaces after every major accident. Why, in an industry so advanced that it can monitor even the slightest vibration of an aircraft wing, are there still no cameras in the cockpit, when we can already record hundreds of flight parameters, high-quality audio, and when today's digital action cameras are cheap, durable, and reliable? What reason does the aviation industry have to keep saying no to a solution that seems so simple and reasonable? It turns out this is not just a technical issue, but a human one, a debate about privacy, trust, and a safety culture built over decades. In this video, we will explore why cockpit cameras are still not mandated, what benefits investigators believe they could bring, and why pilots and unions continue to firmly oppose them. When we talk about cockpit cameras, it's not the kind of camera that live streams to the ground like some webcam or spacecraft launch feed. What aviation accident investigators truly need is a small, sturdy camera that can survive an impact, fixed inside the cockpit to record normal flight operations. The footage from this camera would be stored in a specially protected unit, just like where flight data or voice recordings are currently saved. And just like the other two devices, the video would only be accessed in the event of a serious accident, and usually only records a short segment, for example the last few minutes of the flight. So if we add a camera, what would the black box consist of? You've probably heard of an aircraft's black box, right? In reality, the black box is not a single device but a combination of two main units, and if a cockpit camera were added, we would have a complete trio to better support aviation accident investigations. The first device is the FDR, the flight data recorder, responsible for recording hundreds or even thousands of technical parameters throughout the flight, such as speed, altitude, flap settings, control positions, and even the force pilots apply on the control column. The second device is the CVR, the cockpit voice recorder, used to capture all conversations between pilots, communication with air traffic control, and ambient cockpit sounds. If added, the third device would be the cockpit camera, recording actual images inside the cockpit from the crew's actions and reactions to what was shown on the control screens at the moment of the incident. This is the missing piece that many experts believe could allow investigators to see with their own eyes what happened, instead of relying only on sound and data. With all three devices combined, we would have the most powerful and intuitive accident investigation support system ever. With newer aircraft models like the Boeing 787, the two devices, FDR and CVR, have already been combined into a single unit called a combi unit. This means that just finding one intact box is enough to retrieve both flight data and audio. If a camera were also integrated into this system, that would be excellent because it would add an extra layer of visual data, helping investigators more easily and clearly determine what happened. No more guesswork or ambiguity. The idea of installing cameras in the cockpit is not new at all. It has existed for quite some time, and many draft regulations related to cockpit video recording have been proposed in various parts of the world, including by EASA, the European Union Aviation Safety Agency. In fact, cockpit cameras have already been used in certain types of aircraft. For example, helicopters used for offshore transport, police operations, search and rescue, as well as training aircraft and test planes. These models often come equipped with recording systems. In other words, the technology is already available. Today, there are plenty of compact, durable cameras that work well under various lighting conditions, capable of recording high-quality video and directly connecting to crash-protected storage devices. Some modern black box models are even designed with enough capacity to store video data. All they need is an input source to start recording. So if the technology is ready, and we already have the ability to collect gigabytes of flight data and hours of audio recording, then why haven't cockpit cameras become a mandatory standard? Part of the answer lies in cost. For new aircraft, things are much simpler. Manufacturers can proactively include camera installation in the initial design, choose mounting positions early on, usually high up in the cockpit, directly connect it to the avionics bay, and integrate it into the data recording system. But for older aircraft, meaning those that have been in service for 10-15 years or more, adding new equipment is not just a matter of sticking a camera in. It also brings along a host of associated costs, from recertifying the system to the downtime needed for aircraft upgrades, all of which are very expensive. This is not impossible to do, but it creates a financial burden for airlines, which often operate on profit margins of just a few percent. Incidentally, cost and certification requirements are also the reason why we rarely see external cameras mounted on aircraft bodies, the kind that help pilots visually inspect engines, landing gear, or other sensitive components. Some newer models, like the Boeing 777, have begun to feature these, improving ground maneuvering. But if you're flying a Boeing 737 or Airbus A320, chances are you shouldn't expect any external camera assistance anytime soon. In truth, this is rather unfortunate because many past accident investigations have called for the installation of cameras, most notably the Kegworth air disaster, a serious crash where, had camera footage been available, many questions could have been answered more quickly. Returning to the topic of cockpit cameras, it must be said technical or logistical difficulties are still not convincing enough to explain why this system has not yet been widely implemented. The aviation industry is already used to dealing with much more complex challenges, so adding a few cameras, at first glance, shouldn't be too difficult. And yet to this day, cockpit cameras are still not standard. Why is that the case? The answer, as you'll see, is far more complicated than one might think. But before diving into the debate, let's take a look at why aviation accident investigators are so particularly interested in this issue and why they've repeatedly called for change. You only need to observe how investigation teams work after a crash to understand why they always mention the need for cameras. After every serious incident, they have to start like assembling a massive jigsaw puzzle, gathering every little piece from the wreckage, from surviving data, from all available sources, to reconstruct what actually happened. Of course, airplane debris often provides many clues. But to understand the full picture, especially the sequence of events and the underlying causes, investigators rely heavily on two main recording devices, FDR and CVR. These are extremely powerful tools. Thanks to them, investigators can trace the root cause of even the most complex chains of events. More importantly, they help the aviation industry learn from mistakes, so tragedies are not repeated in the future, and that is the core goal of every accident investigation. However, it must also be acknowledged, those two devices only show part of the story. Flight data may reveal what the aircraft did, but not always why. Audio recordings may let us hear what the pilot said, but they don't show how they reacted or what actions they took at the most critical moments. And this is where cockpit cameras become incredibly valuable. Major investigation bodies like the NTSB and AIB have repeatedly and officially recommended the installation of cockpit cameras. To them, this is an essential supplementary tool to fill the remaining gaps, and they're not just making empty claims. They hold a wealth of real-world examples, accidents in which, had cameras been available, many uncertainties could have been resolved more quickly, more clearly, and more accurately. In many serious aviation accident investigations, one recurring issue is the absence of cockpit video's missing piece that could help fill important gaps in the data. A prime example is the crash of Atlas Air 3591 in 2019. The Boeing 767 cargo plane crashed into Trinity Bay, Texas while preparing to land in Houston. The initial cause was the aircraft being unintentionally switched to TO/GA mode, meaning go-around, which caused the engines to suddenly increase thrust. This led the first officer to experience spatial disorientation, mistakenly believing the aircraft was about to stall, and instinctively pushed the control column down, resulting in the crash. Although investigators were able to reconstruct most of the event using recorded data and audio, they still could not determine exactly how the TO/GA mode was activated. They suspected that the first officer had made an unusual input on the speed brake lever, but had there been a cockpit camera, this could have been confirmed immediately. Another example is Sriwijaya Air 182, which crashed into the waters off Jakarta in 2021. The FDR was recovered from the seabed, but the CVR was damaged and did not capture complete audio from all microphones. As a result, investigators struggled to fully understand the crew's decision-making process before control was lost. If video had been available, it could have clearly shown what the pilots were doing or trying to do. Going further back, the Egypt Air 990 crash in 1999 remains controversial to this day. The US NTSB concluded that the first officer deliberately caused the crash, but Egypt rejected this conclusion. The audio recordings from the cockpit were vague and inconclusive. The lack of visual footage further prevented both sides from reaching a unified conclusion about the cause of the crash. From these examples, one thing is clear. Cockpit cameras could significantly shorten investigation timelines, eliminate doubt, and add visual context to the existing data. Instead of having to guess who performed what action or what was displayed on the screens at the moment of the incident, a video would provide a clear answer immediately. From the perspective of aviation accident investigators, the benefits of cockpit cameras are beyond debate. More information, less speculation, and faster conclusions. At a public meeting of the NTSB, Ken Smart, former head of the AIB, stated, "Cockpit cameras would provide essential information in the majority of the accidents we investigate. The remarkable thing is," he said this in July 2004, that's more than 20 years ago. The reason cockpit cameras still haven't become a reality is not because the technology is lacking, but because of a more complex issue: the lack of consensus among stakeholders. When drafting regulations concerning cockpit cameras, regulatory body, especially at the international level, must carefully balance the benefits against the concerns of multiple parties, from investigators, airlines, aircraft manufacturers, and most importantly, the pilot workforce. And it is on the pilot side that the debate often faces the most resistance. The first reason is privacy. In the cockpit, pilots don't just operate the aircraft, it's also where they must make life or death decisions under extreme pressure, sometimes during the final moments of their lives. They may also share personal thoughts, express emotions such as fear or frustration with the job, and many do not want those private moments recorded, let alone leaked. There have been real instances where black box audio was leaked, causing deep trauma for victims' families and the pilot community. If audio alone was already this serious, then video could cause even greater harm, especially if misunderstood, edited out of context, or spread online. Another concern is that cameras could alter pilot behavior in the cockpit. The cockpit is a work environment that depends on coordination between two or more people, built on trust and open communication. A good captain must foster an environment where the first officer feels comfortable speaking up something vital for flight safety. However, if being recorded, people may become guarded, hesitant, or act in a way that looks good on camera rather than focus on the actual problem. Others might become overly compliant, losing their initiative, which could reduce the effectiveness of teamwork. Still, there are counter-arguments. The CVR cockpit voice recorder has existed for a long time, and if such monitoring really did negatively affect pilot behavior, the consequences would have already shown. But in reality, that has not happened. For over 20 years, the aviation industry and regulators have worked together to build a delicate system known as just culture. This is a foundation that encourages pilots to voluntarily report mistakes, raise safety concerns, and speak candidly about what happened without fear of personal blame. Trust is key. Pilots believe that this system was designed to fix errors, not punish honest mistakes which any human is capable of making. And because of that, no one wants to sacrifice this fragile balance just to add one more layer of surveillance. From another angle, concerns about privacy have already been raised in the past regarding the CVR. Thankfully, most aviation incidents do not result in fatalities. But imagine, if a crash occurred while the pilot was complaining or criticizing the airline, and that recording was later played back right in front of them, along with representatives of that very airline, the psychological impact would be hard to avoid. And since each country handles recorded audio data differently, the addition of video only heightens fears of surveillance, invasion of privacy, or being used as a tool for control or punishment. For many pilot unions, this is seen as a sign of distrust, and they do not accept that. That is why organizations like ALPA, Airline Pilots Association, BALPA, and IFALP, International Federation of Airline Pilots Association SOL, firmly oppose the installation of cockpit cameras. ALPA argues that video recordings are not truly necessary for improving flight safety and might even distort investigations. BALPA worries that footage of a crash's final moments, if leaked, could cause serious psychological trauma to victims' families and even investigators themselves. Meanwhile, IFALPA, which represents more than 100,000 pilots worldwide, warns that video recording poses a major risk to privacy and could undermine existing protections in the industry. In other words, the issue is not just should we record video or not, but rather, are we eroding the fragile trust that holds together all the parties in the aviation world? Some pilots and unions have also raised very practical concerns. They ask, where would the camera be placed and in which direction would it record? Would it have a wide angle to capture the entire cockpit, or would it focus only on the instrument panel, display screens, or the pilot's hands? Who would have access to the footage? Would the data be fully encrypted? And if there were a criminal investigation alongside the accident investigation, could the footage be used as evidence in court? Additionally, is there a risk that the airline might use the footage for internal disciplinary action against the pilots? The bigger question is, how can we ensure that a tool meant for safety and investigation is not misused? These concerns are not unfounded. There have been past cases of leaked audio recordings which led to deep mistrust from pilot unions. To them, a camera is not just a recording device but a gateway to a new dimension they can't control. Unions argue that aside from certain special cases, most aviation accidents have already been effectively investigated using existing tools like flight data, cockpit audio, wreckage analysis, and procedural evaluation. Only in a small number of cases, like the ones mentioned earlier, could video shorten the investigation timeline or clarify hard-to-determine details. So, is it truly necessary? But this opens a new line of thought. Is there a compromise solution, a version of the cockpit camera that pilot unions might also accept? A system that offers investigative value while protecting privacy and, most importantly, maintains the trust between all parties involved? In fact, there have already been some promising compromise proposal zones that provide clear investigative value without altering the fundamental nature of the cockpit work environment. One suggestion is to install cameras with limited angles, recording only the instrument panel and equipment instead of capturing the entire cockpit or filming the pilots. The purpose of this system is to accurately record what is displayed or operated, especially useful when other data is missing, corrupted, or unclear. Another idea is a conditional recording system that only activates in certain situations, such as collision alerts, terrain warnings, or sudden altitude loss, where, the camera would automatically record a short clip, for example, 2 minutes. Whichever approach is chosen, if a video recording system is to be implemented, it must come with appropriate safeguards both to ensure privacy and preserve investigative integrity. With clear regulations that the video is only used for accident investigations, never leaked, and not used for any other purpose, I see no reason why this technology shouldn't be applied within the next few years. In the end, cockpit cameras are not just a story about technology, but a story about people, trust, and how we choose to balance privacy with collective safety. No one denies the clear benefits that a piece of video footage can bring to an accident investigation, but we also cannot ignore the legitimate concerns of those who sit in the cockpit every day. If a balanced solution can be found where data is protected, pilots are respected, and investigators are better equipped, then perhaps it's time for cockpit cameras to become a part of the next generation black box. Because the truth, when seen, is not only clearer, it's easier to understand.